She came, she paused, then pretty much went along with David Cameron's deal for China to fund the Hinkley Point nuclear plant. Did Theresa May grandstand and then panic? Good evening. Pausing the Hinkley Point nuclear deal was Theresa May's dramatic entrance as Prime Minister. It made her look tough. Today, she pressed play again, without much changing the plot. The Chinese will help fund the new nuclear plant after all. So was it a political gesture that could have wrecked Chinese investment in Britain, or has the PM achieved something? Also tonight, Britain should stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia amid evidence it's bombing civilians against international law, say 2 committees of MPs. But a third says we should carry on selling. Who will ministers listen to? Leading charities warn cuts to social care have left the poor and elderly at the mercy of a postcode lottery. And as Hillary Clinton shakes off pneumonia, Donald Trump waves a doctor's letter saying he's fat but fit. It's been hailed as marking the relaunch of nuclear power in Europe, but the delayed government decision to give the go-ahead to the £18 billion plant at Hinkley Point in Somerset was clearly not taken without considerable misgivings. Ministers claim they've achieved significant new safeguards to protect national security, but there is little obvious change to the terms of Chinese involvement. So what was the delay really all about? Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
The diggers carried on their work even though Theresa May put this project on pause. An £18 billion nuclear power station at Hinkley Point in Somerset. Signed off by Theresa May's long-standing arch-rival, the former Chancellor George Osborne. Today the government said it could go ahead, improved and reformed.
Now, having reviewed the project, the government is satisfied that the improved deal and the other changes announced today will for the first time remedy the weaknesses of the previous regime for foreign ownership of critical infrastructure.
But is the deal seriously changed? The guaranteed electricity price the government promised to the French energy firm EDF, which some thought far too high, stays exactly the same. The Chinese were stumping up a third of the bill for Hinkley, believe they've got an agreement signed just a year ago, which means in return for that contribution, they get to design and build a nuclear power station at Bradwell in Essex. Today, the Chinese said they feel that agreement still stands. And so did the boss of EDF.
This project is part of a program in which, with our partners, we will develop in due time Sizewell and Bradwell.
OK, but you don't have any specific reassurances on that at this moment?
I have a total reassurance that it will be the case.
The government says it's introduced a new guarantee that there can't be undesirable sell-offs of power stations to foreign powers. But there was a review of foreign investment conducted by senior officials in Whitehall just 3 years ago. And that concluded that overseas ownership wasn't a problem, as long as there was control over data in this country and vetting by GCHQ of staff who work in power station control rooms. Although this meeting with President Xi of China 2 weeks ago was friendly, China was threatening to pull the plug on other investments here if Theresa May blocked their hopes of building a Chinese-designed power station on the site of this old power station at Bradwell in Essex.
I think because this is an economic issue, I think the investment tap would have been turned off or at least tightened somewhat. So I think it would have been damaging. And that was predictable, which is why I think she was silly to say in doing in the first place, this review.
The Prime Minister also didn't want to risk adding to Britain's serious decline in electricity supply, as old nuclear power stations and coal-fired power stations are shut down. Compared to 2012 levels, capacity drops, and by 2030 would be only 60% of recent capacity. If Hinkley's working by then, it pips the dial up a bit. Other mainly nuclear reactors could get it up more, but still doesn't get it to the levels the country's been used to. Theresa May's review threw the spotlight again on this most controversial project, only to find she had to sign up to it after all. One of her first judgment calls in office, one of the biggest price tag decisions any Prime Minister has had to make. Hinkley C, dubbed by Greenpeace the most expensive object on Earth.
Well, our business correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is with me. Why are the economics of this such a nightmare?
Well, Gary talked about it being dubbed the most expensive project on earth. And to be honest, it's consumers who are bearing the brunt of this. While the government may argue that energy security is a price worth paying for, today's decision is going to affect 3 generations for 35 years. Since the deal's inception in 2013, the price has ballooned from just over £6 billion to just under £30 billion. That's a 5-fold increase, and it could go up further. And in fact, if you do the mathematics, it means per household in the UK, we're each going to fork over £1,100 for the deal. At the heart of this is what they call the strike price, the cost of electricity. And the government has agreed that consumers will pay EDF £92.50 for 35 years. But today's electricity price, just £37. And that's the controversy, that for 35 years, consumers end up paying over the odds.
Thanks, Javier. Now, Britain must stop selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, says a key report by MPs, amid allegations they're being used against international humanitarian law on civilians in Yemen. But there was serious disagreement between MPs on the Arms Export Control Committee, and a rival report says let the sales go on. Both groups, however, demand an independent UN inquiry into the bombing of rebels in Yemen by the Arab coalition of which Saudi Arabia is part. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, reports.
Saudi Arabia is a vital part of the Arab coalition fighting the Iranian-backed rebel uprising in Yemen. And the UK sells arms to Saudi Arabia, lots of arms. And those arms inevitably, says one parliamentary committee today, are being used by the Saudis to break international law and kill civilians. The committee said today an independent international inquiry is urgently needed to investigate this, and crucially,
until that has been completed, the UK must halt the sale of all weapons that could be used in the conflict between the Saudi-led coalition and rebel forces in Yemen.
But Parliament's divided. This afternoon, in an extraordinary piece of committee theatre, just as the joint business and development committees were saying stop the arms going to Saudi, the Foreign Affairs Committee also reported.
The committee considers that the courts are the most appropriate body to judge whether the government has broken the law. This will now be established in the upcoming judicial review granted to the campaign against arms trade.
So they don't want a ban, but they also do want an international inquiry. However, that committee also noted that no matter how important our relations with Saudi Arabia might be, wider moral and legal considerations are ultimately more important. And the Saudis themselves, well, they continue to insist their bombing campaign is carefully targeted.
Britain and America are allies. They know how this war started. They know that we have a legitimate purpose in this war. They know we are being extremely careful in minimizing civilian casualties, and they know that we have in place a mechanism to investigate and make sure that we take procedures that prevent any repetition of mistakes from happening, just like happens in all wars.
But on the ground, the misery for Yemenis deepens. Channel 4's Unreported World recently finding that hundreds of thousands of civilians face malnutrition because it is alleged the Arab coalition of which Saudi is a part have bombed warehouses and the infrastructure to deliver food.
Now, the chair of that joint committee on arms export controls, the Conservative MP Chris White, is in Warwick, and we're joined from Putney in South London by Nadeem Zahawi, a Conservative member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. They're the ones who said keep selling the arms. Chris White, first of all, Britain has sold about £3 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia since the war in Yemen began. So to want to halt that, you must be very concerned indeed at how the weapons are being used. Can you tell us about the evidence you heard that international law was being broken?
We've heard a great deal of evidence on the committee being set up earlier this year to look specifically at the conflict in Yemen, as you've mentioned on your programme already, in terms of warehouses, in terms of building, in terms of civilians. We've spoken to NGOs that are very clear that there have been violations on international humanitarian law. And I think the conclusion that we have reached, unfortunately and regrettably, between just 2 committees, the Business Committee and the International Development Committee, makes a very clear case that we should cease the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia until we have clearly had a United Nations-led international investigation of what has been happening on the ground.
What happened in this disagreement? Because Crispin Blunt, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, has been accused of walking out and basically, ignoring the democratic will of the committee. Is that true?
The committee meets in private to discuss reports of this nature, and as far as I'm concerned, what took place in that committee will remain private.
OK, Nadeem Zahawi, you voted through this alternative report by Crispin Blunt to say we should carry on with weapons sales. Did you read all the oral and written evidence given to the Arms Export Control Committee before making that decision?
We looked at it very carefully, Krish. Earlier in the week, we published a report into the intervention in Libya, where we were deeply critical of the previous government for not following the evidence and having robust evidence, intelligence. You quite rightly introduced this piece by saying these are allegations. There are allegations of atrocities on both sides.
Yeah, did you read all the evidence?
The Houthi militia, who initially... Well, absolutely, we looked at this, and what
you did personally
the final
before
conclusion,
voting
yes,
through. Yeah.
Let me just finish this point. If you believe that the Saudi-led coalition, which includes Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and other countries, intentionally seek to hurt civilians and bomb them as part of their campaign in Yemen, then you ought to vote in favour of the KAC report that's been voted on by 2 committees, not all 4 committees that make up. We do not believe on the Foreign Affairs Committee that there is evidence that clearly shows the intention of the Saudi-led coalition to actually harm civilians. There have been mistakes made, of course. We are very, very strongly condemning those atrocities. We strongly recommend that the Saudis are much more transparent about the way they investigate it and in a timely manner. But you've got to remember, you need the evidence for this. Otherwise, you're just seen as being politically motivated and reactionary.
And in case the Saudis don't let in that international inquiry, we'll just carry on selling them the jets and the bombs anyway. Despite all that evidence from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty, all the views of international charities like Oxfam.
Well, we had the Saudi foreign minister meet a cross-party delegation, and people like Hilary Benn and others pressed him on making sure that the United Nations is able to conduct that inquiry. So does our committee, and that's what we want the Saudis to do. We're not letting the Saudis off the
and if
hook
they
here.
refuse,
we want to follow the evidence. What's that? I didn't
if they
catch that,
refuse,
Chris.
would you say halt the sales if they refuse to let in
I
an
think
independent
we would
UN
have
inquiry?
to review. We would have to review the position. The Saudis have been very upfront by saying, look, we've made mistakes, we want to investigate them, we want to do it transparently. We call on the British government to actually engage and help them in doing that. We also call on the British government to make sure that our personnel and that the government actually knows what our personnel are actually doing on the ground.
Chris White.
So this report is not in any way a let-off.
Chris White, do you think this is a principled position taken by Crispin Blunt and his colleagues?
I don't want to comment on Crispin Blunt's position. I do think, however,
that speaks volumes, but you can't say it is a principled decision.
We have given the Saudis a great deal of time to come forward with their evidence, with their investigations. That is not happening as the way it should be, and I think it would be right and proper, unless there are things we should not know, to give the UN an opportunity to see what has happened.
Chris White, Nadeem Zahawi, thank you both very much indeed. Well, to Syria now, where the UN has accused the government of failing to produce permits to deliver desperately needed aid into rebel-held eastern Aleppo as part of the ceasefire. Around 40 trucks are still being held at the Turkish border, waiting for permission to cross into Syria. Though the fighting has subsided since the ceasefire was announced on Monday, activists say airstrikes are still continuing in Homs and Idlib province, as well as areas around Aleppo itself. Unfair, disproportionate and unreasonable. That's the verdict of the police standards watchdog of the treatment of the South Yorkshire Chief Constable David Crompton. He was suspended earlier this year over his handling of the inquests into the Hillsborough Football Stadium disaster. But this programme has learned that the Chief Inspector of Constabulary has written to a council panel which is hearing the case tomorrow, opposing the suspension. Kathy has this exclusive report.
The Hillsborough disaster was not only a catastrophic tragedy for the families of the 96 football fans who lost their lives, it was also a catastrophic failure of policing. Earlier this year, an inquest jury ruled that blunders by the police had caused or contributed to the deaths. The day after that verdict, the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police, David Crompton, was suspended by the local Police and Crime Commissioner. The Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Sir Tom Windsor, is legally obliged to give his views on the dismissal proceedings.
I understand the Chief Inspector has come to the conclusion that David Crompton was unfairly suspended from his job here at South Yorkshire Police. In an extraordinarily strongly worded response, he accuses the Police and Crime Commissioner of acting unreasonably and says Mr. Crompton should get his job back.
In documents seen by Channel 4 News, the Chief Inspector says the suspension of David Crompton is
conspicuously unfair, disproportionate and so unreasonable that I cannot understand how the Police and Crime Commissioner has reached this view.
Lou Brooks, whose brother Andrew died in the crash at Hillsborough, feels utterly let down.
It was unfair to blame the survivors and the 96 victims of Hillsborough for their own deaths. That was what was unfair. And I'll tell you what else is unfair. The hell this force has put us families through and still continue to put us families through is absolutely disgraceful, absolutely appalling.
South Yorkshire Police have repeatedly apologised for their failures and now accept the fans were in no way to blame. But during the inquest, the police legal team angered families by raising questions about the fans' behaviour.
I do blame their leadership and culture, which seems rotten to the core.
The Labour MP Andy Burnham accused the police of rowing back on their apology and challenged them to explain why. It was a statement from Mr. Crompton insisting he'd never tried to defend the failures of his force, simply to put them into context, that was the final straw for the Police and Crime Commissioner. He used his powers to suspend the Chief Constable, writing,
I considered the Chief Constable's statement to be a monumental error of judgment, which could only heighten suspicion that what the critics were saying was right all along, that South Yorkshire Police was a police force that would not fully accept the verdicts, but had to go on justifying itself.
The Chief Inspector disagrees, saying no one who had fairly read Mr. Crompton's statement
could rationally have concluded that Chief Constable Crompton was refusing to accept the verdict of the jury or rescinding the full apology already made. He plainly was not.
We've had 30 years in which the families who were affected by Hillsborough that day, losing 96 people from their families, who have fought for decades now to get the truth out. They have been pushed back, let's be honest about it, they've been pushed back time and time again by police and others who try to say that somehow it was the fault of the fans.
Mr. Crompton's supporters believe the Police and Crime Commissioner has overreached himself, bringing politics into policing. But his many detractors point to other serious controversies during his time at the helm, not least over child sexual exploitation in Rotherham. Local councillors meet tomorrow to consider his fate.
Well, the South Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner, Dr Alan Billings, has told us he is unable to comment until the Police and Crime panel has made its recommendation. Cuts to social care funding are leaving the poor and the elderly at the mercy of a postcode lottery. That's the warning from two leading health charities. They say the cuts, combined with shortages of nurses and care workers, leave the poorest relying on an increasingly threadbare local authority safety net. Our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald, has been meeting one family that is already struggling with the system.
He was a talker, all right. He had a great sense of humour. He loves his family, he still loves his family, you could see. And very caring man.
Jackie Brown moved in with her father in 2012 when his dementia worsened, and she says she wants to keep looking after him in his own home for as long as she can and for as long as it's safe. And yet so often the help she hopes for from social services does not appear. A promised stair lift, for instance, or an adapted bathroom.
My main worry is because Dad's mobility going up and down the stairs is not very good and he will fall. I'm worried that he will fall down the stairs and there's nothing I can do to prevent that. They came out and now I've done another call to find out what's happened about the stair, the stair lift, and was told that the occupational therapist has left. Therefore, I need to have another referral, which is totally unacceptable.
So she's back to square one. And in a report by the Richmond Group of Charities today called Real Lives, these stories are being repeated in homes across England.
When you want that little bit of help, you just expect that person at the end of the phone to give a response and at least somebody to give you a call back in a reasonable time frame, really, and to show that somebody out there cares.
This report was launched alongside research by the King's Fund and the Nuffield Trust into social care for older people, and it makes bleak reading. Over the space of 5 years, 250,000 fewer people now receive care. So who gets it? Well, it depends on where they live and how rich they are, the report says.
We were most concerned that there are a huge number of people out there who are reliant on an increasingly threadbare safety net to help support them with what we're talking about is the essentials of everyday life. So helping people get out to bed in the morning, helping them eat, really basic but vital services. And we don't actually know what's happening to the people who now are no longer eligible for local government support.
There is a warning too that care homes are struggling. Councils are paying less for residents, wages are going up, and there's a shortage of nurses.
This care home behind me used to be owned by Southern Cross. They owned a number of them across the country. When the company went bust in 2011, it sent a shudder through the industry. Now today's report says that because of the unprecedented pressure on the care home sector, it is a matter of when, not if, that another provider goes out of business.
The Department of Health says it is significantly increasing social care funding, but the report's authors say that's not available until 2020 and they need it now. In the meantime, there is a growing number of unpaid carers, the people like Jackie, who do it out of love, of course, but who also need help that does not always come.
Hillary Clinton is returning to the presidential campaign trail after her brush with pneumonia. To counter questions about her fitness for office, she released medical records. And her Republican rival, Donald Trump, has been talking about his health on a TV show. Kylie Morris is in Washington. Kylie, how's your health?
Chris, I'm feeling fine. Thank you so much for asking. I seem to have escaped walking pneumonia. I don't know whether I'm as healthy as Donald Trump, though, who seems enormously healthy, judging by his appearance on the Dr. Oz show today. He was under pressure to release more medical records, so he has done that. He wasn't quizzed in great detail, but this is how his appearance alongside Dr. Oz looked.
Hormone problems like thyroid issues? Nope. Blood sugar problems? Nope. Diabetes? Any heart problems? Nope.
A couple of
lung complaints, asthma, wheezing?
No, nothing. Really nothing. It's been, people are amazed. I haven't had a cold in a long time. Years.
So yes, judging by that, of course, we didn't get very much forensic detail at all on this, and he had been under pressure because he'd only released previously a note that was kind of jotted off by his doctor in New York, but that's as much clarity and transparency, I think, we can expect from him for now.
Has any of it moved the polls?
There has been movement in the polls, troubling for the Clinton campaign. The most recent poll today, which took into account what happened last Sunday, shows that she is losing support. It is very tight, judging by this New York Times CBS poll. And the most concerning aspect of that is not so much that he is gaining support, but as I said, she is losing support. So she really has her work cut out for her in the few weeks remaining, certainly before the first debate.
And do you think that's about pneumonia?
Sorry, say that again?
If she's losing support, do you think that's about pneumonia?
If she's losing support, what did you say about
Is this about pneumonia?
Is it about pneumonia? No, it's a political problem for her now. I think it's fair to say, not really a health problem. She'll recover from the pneumonia, but can she recover in the polls as quickly as she needs to?
Thanks, Kylie. Hearing check, perhaps. Now, it's been another golden day in Rio for Paralympics. Sorry, I'm laughing now. It's been a golden day in Rio for Paralympics GB, with the canoeists winning 3 of their races. Leading the way was 46-year-old Jeanette Chippington, who held off the German world champion Adina Muller to take the KL1 gold. She'd previously won 12 Paralympic swimming medals, the first of which came in 1988 in Seoul. The team's medal total has now passed the 100 mark. And that's it. We're back tomorrow at 7. Till then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.